Hello and welcome to the Confusion Wrestling Podcast, the last bastion of independent wrestling. I'm your host, Rob Kammer, and we have had quite the shuffle this week. I was originally supposed to have an interview, but we got like a potential Big Mama situation going on here where things just keep popping up because people have lives and whatnot. So that interview didn't come to fruition, at least this week. We'll see how things go later on. And, I don't like to double book things because I only like to release things once a week because, schedules are cool. People like schedules and whatnot. And, I mean, there's wrestling-shattering news, no matter how you want to look at it this week. So I did, previously have, I had an indie spotlight set up, ready to go. And then the news dropped today, as I record it at present time, on Thursday, July 24th. So we'll probably just throw the other episode, because it'll be kind of quasi-out-of-date-ish, by the time I get around to it, in theory. So we'll maybe just pop that up on the Patreon as a special bonus. So be sure to sign up at the Patreon /CASSONOVA, and whenever that goes up. But really, I would be remiss, despite the strong focus on independent wrestling on this podcast. Obviously, I famously say, I don't deal with the big leagues. But it's not often that, well, hopefully it's not often that you lose a chunk of your childhood. I'm sure you all have heard by the time this podcast is released that Terry Bollea, Hulk Hogan, has passed away. And I would most definitely be remiss if I didn't say something about it. Am I going to talk for a half hour about it? I don't know. I don't have a script prepared. I don't have a statement ready for this event because, well, I have a life, and sometimes it's just best to, speak from the heart for certain things. And I'll kind of, break this down into two parts. The first of which we will talk about Hulk Hogan. For most of us, especially if you were born, before the year 2000, there is a good chance that Hulk Hogan was one of the guys that inspired you to become a professional wrestling fan. He was over the top, in theory, a wholesome do-gooder, a fighter for justice in the realm of professional wrestling, willing to, take on all foes head on, mostly coming from the Heenan family, but, throughout other, chunks of the World Wrestling Federation. He was integral to the expansion during the rock and wrestling era that kind of marked the end of the territories and brought professional wrestling to a bit more of the mainstream. I know WWE likes to whitewash everything, and everything that before 1984 was, backroom brawls, there were no arena shows, etc. And we know now that that's not entirely true, if true at all. But Hogan was a big part of that expansion, and we have to acknowledge that there is a distinct possibility that without someone like Hogan, that the expansion, for better or for worse, may not happen at all. I mean, there was rumors about who Vince was going to hitch his rag into, whether it was Kerry Von Erich or Dusty Rhodes, or even I've heard Ric Flair tossed out there as well. And let's be realistic, to the heights that Hulkamania went, I honestly, we can debate this all day, and I think only Dusty Rhodes has half a chance at being the guy to pull that off. And even then, I don't think he was, the perfect storm that was needed. Hogan at the time was just kind of everything that you wanted to see in a professional wrestler. He was literally larger than life. He was, sculpted like the Greek gods, 6'6", 300 pounds, bombastic, but was always sticking up for the little guy. He stood up for Mean Gene when people were picking on him, even famously tag teaming with Mean Gene. He brought, he brought quote unquote friends and fans in and trained them to make them wrestlers. Most notably Hillbilly Jim, who sparked a whole wave of hillbillies in the WWF, and Tugboat, amongst others, got the official Hulk Hogan seal of approval. Heck, even the Honky Tonk Man originally had the Hulk Hogan seal of approval before turning heel in his early appearances. But that early era, especially for me, that's where I came to things. My earliest memories, involving professional wrestling, really involved Hulk Hogan. Even if I wasn't watching him wrestle, watching his bombastic promos, talked about the 24-inch pythons, saying our prayers, taking our vitamins, all that sort of good stuff. Those memories are hazy in my head because I was, pretty much too young to form full cognizant memories of that time, just because I was so little. But I grew up a wrestling fan. I grew up watching the Hulkster. I never live because our family's finances didn't allow for that expenditure, but I was in awe of the concept of, Warrior versus Hogan, the passing of the torch. As much as I loved Warrior, I was always a Hogan guy. I had, all the Hogan toys and whatnot. Watching him get the title back and with his feud with Sergeant Slaughter, and kind of moving on from there, it just, blew my fragile little fan mind. And moving on, to his run in WCW, where he was kind of stale-ish, but I watched both. I was one of before the Monday Night Wars, I just watched wrestling, man. I watched WCW Saturday night, and I would catch the start of Nitro, what would become the Monday Night Wars, and the shock of Hulk Hogan joining the NWO, Hulk Hogan turning heel, which was something unimaginable. And even though now, thanks to the internet, or some of the older fans, know that Hulk Hogan kind of started out as a heel, and Hulk Boulder and Sterling Golden were not friendly to the fans, so to speak. But that was before Hulk Hogan, after, before he became a hero to all, for the most part. And see him, turn his back on all of that to, as he famously put it, people were throwing garbage in the ring, and every piece of garbage in that ring represents one of those fans, and just blew me away. And it's just I was 13 or so when that happened. And so going into my teenage years, that was just as transformative as, as a wrestling fan, and to a lesser extent as a person. Yes, I know it was a work, but just the sheer shock of that, and watching, say your prayers, take your vitamins, goody two shoes kind of become, what we now call a cool heel, with the NWO, though, in retrospect, we could, ask how cool Hogan was, whatever, man. But for somebody who's, the magic was still there, was just absolutely crazy to see. And then for me, I grew older, and just kind of Hogan kind of became lame again, as all these other upstarts were coming up and being just as cool. And he had guys like Sting, also totally reinvent himself at this time as well, but still kind of, for the most part, stay on the, positive side of things, still being a babyface, to use the inside parlance. But it was, it was freaking amazing just to see all that. And then, we got his feel-good run around 2000, was it 2002-ish? 2003, we got the feel good remembrance run during the original brand split, where the people were ready for Hulk Hogan again, and the power of the Hulkamaniac's brother turned him away from the NWO and brought back the red and yellow. For the first time in 3 years. Let's be realistic. He brought back the red and yellow back in WCW a couple times after going to Hollywood. But people were actually ready for that nostalgia run when he wrestled The Rock and beat the Undertaker for the heavyweight championship and whatnot. But of course, the time since then hasn't been entirely kind to the Hulkster, and even worse for Terry Bollea. but like we got to see like a TNA run that, let's face it, was not that great. A Hulkamania tour that, like, to some extent no one wanted, because no one was really clamoring for 50-year-old Hulk Hogan and 50-year-old Ric Flair bleeding all over the place, when neither of them were that great anymore. But it was, but up until like these point in like the last decade or so, even as he's using the Hulk Hogan name, things for Hogan Knows Best, and then more recently, the his Hulk Hogan All-American beer, the alleged attempt to purchase Hooters, and the American Freestyle Wrestling project that he has going on here, have not done a whole lot to endear him to the public since then. But no one can deny the impact Hulk Hogan had on the industry. And was he the right guy at the right time? Oh, almost most definitely. But it was him, and we have to acknowledge that. And so it's okay to be upset with, well, we'll put it out like the last decade of Hogan's life as we start going behind the curtain. But that leads me to Terry Bollea. As much as we can admire Hulk Hogan, Terry Bollea, on the other hand, has shown himself, to at a certain level be the subject of contempt, and let's face it, rightfully so, given the nature of many of the things that have come up about him over the course of the last decade. And we hear these stories, and it goes, we pull back the curtain even behind Hulk Hogan, the character, and note that Hogan was during the 80s a notorious union buster. He was as professional wrestlers were being dude, we need to band together and protect each other ultimately from promoters and or people that are willing to exploit them, because let's face it, they don't get health insurance, they're not considered employees, but they're not also allowed to necessarily go do regular employee stuff either, or non-employee stuff. Hogan was a union buster on that, because basically, let's be realistic, unionization is something that's traditionally something that's beneficial for the all. Unfortunately, as a whole, for it to benefit everyone's got to be on board, and it doesn't always benefit, the top 1%. And those are the guys that are going to be the ones that kind of leak things. And Hogan allegedly snitched out Jesse Ventura's plan to Vince McMahon, who immediately put the boot down on any threats of unionization or collective bargaining. And then as we move through the 90s, we start hearing stories of his politics backstage about what's now a famous phrase called "That's not going to work for me, brother." He famously was not willing to pass the torch to Bret Hart because he didn't think someone like Bret's size could, put on a believable match with Hogan. And so they had this whole thing with Yokozuna. Not to say that Yokozuna wasn't necessarily worthy of it, but at a certain level, fans were definitely looking back, ready to kind of see Hogan and Bret kind of the new and old school kind of clash it out, even though both of them have, were surprisingly close in age and surprisingly close in experience as well. But we hear the machinations like that, and then we hear all the stuff going into WCW about how the Office was interested in pushing, Billy Kidman or whatnot. But again, Hogan didn't think it would be, reasonable for someone like Kidman to stand toe to toe with the Hulkster brother Jack Dude. Amongst other things, or the rumor where he got into Nick Patrick's ear about Sting at Starrcade, and his run in TNA reviled because TNA was finally getting some momentum, and then Hogan brought in all of his lackeys. No one wanted to see the Nasty Boys in 2009. No one wanted to see Val Venus be the one to stop Christopher Daniels' momentum that he was building in TNA at the time, and we got the various rehashes of the NWO ad nauseum, even within the realm of TNA. They just couldn't call him the NWO. That's just on the wrestling front as well. God, lest we forget the infamous Bubba the Love Sponge sex tape that totally opened up Hogan as kind of a well, not just kinda, but as a racist, Brother Jack dude. Definitely like shattering the dreams of millions of Hulkamaniacs out there with his some of his abhorrent views on race and his daughter's dating life on that matter. The irreparable damage that he had not done a whole lot to rectify or fix, because like even allegedly his apology speech to the WWE locker room was basically "Don't get caught, brothers." Like that's not an apology. Like watch out for phones. And then like we see things like on Hogan's Knows Best, like how he treated Brooke, and now it's like she's come out and flat out accused her parents of various abuse, which we could see kind of like the emotional abuse aspect on national television, crazily enough. And the leaked transcripts of the poor gentleman that was in a car accident with Nick Hogan, and basically just said he basically just called it like God's will, and if bad things happen to you like that, like obviously you're not right with God. And gosh, so much for the Christly teachings of empathy, right? We hear these things, and then like if we want to jump into the political realm, I mean, I don't want to go deep dive into politics on this thing, but like, and then his his recent tagging along with the MAGA movement, it leaves a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth as well. And so it becomes quite ironic that a man that was, cherished throughout the realm of professional wrestling, like one of his last appearances, but his last appearance in a professional wrestling aspect was booed practically off the stage on a Monday Night Raw, in a sick way. That was fitting. A fitting end to the legacy of Hulk Hogan. So I end this with, however you feel about his passing is valid. If you want to celebrate the character and what he's done for the perception of professional wrestling and your childhood, so be it. But if you also want to focus on kind of what a garbage fire his real life was, that is just as valid as well. And, handle these things as you will, whether it's celebration, just complete no selling of its existence, or, finding a faux grave to piss on. All these things, are valid. And we're hearing the word complicated tossed out quite a bit. And I don't think that is necessarily an appropriate word for this, because at a certain level, like Hulk Hogan wasn't complicated. Neither was Terry Bollea. And I think, and they are most definitely like two sides ultimately of the same coin. But those are just my thoughts brought into things. And as I said, I have this rant, because, for better or for worse, like this is what got me into professional wrestling. Little did, 3-year-old Rob, know about what was happening behind the scenes, and God forbid, like little Rob know the future of, where Hulk Hogan and Terry Bollea would take us now that, I'm a 40-plus-year-old man as well. So that being said, that is how I'm going to end things. the usual stuff. Stay tuned for the plugs. Thanks for listening to this rant, this rare occasion where I talk about, we'll call it big league things. But just because, like, for good, bad, whatever, like, we have to acknowledge, like, in the realm of professional wrestling, this is a pretty darn big event, and there's very few things that could probably be bigger, whether we want to acknowledge that or not. So thank you all for listening, and stay tuned for the plugs. Hopefully, we're all good with this. So until then, catch you all next week. The Confusion Wrestling Podcast is a weekly podcast that is written and performed by Rob Kammer and hosted by Spotify for podcasters. The background music for this section is Ruined by Day, performed by Alan Schroeder. If you enjoyed this podcast and would like to help support, please like, subscribe, and tell your friends, family, and enemies. Leaving a review is helpful as well, because word-of-mouth advertisement is very important for us small podcasts. My social media links can be found in the description, but Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky are at The Nova of Cass. That's TheNovaOfCass, and Facebook is MLW Confusion, all one word. If you'd like to support monetarily and help upgrade my equipment, please check out my virtual tip jar at ko-fi.com/Casanova, or if you prefer more bang for your buck, go to patreon.com/Casanova, that's CASSONOVA, where for as little as $2, backers get access to the podcast early and without those pesky ads, plus other exclusive content. So join the crew that is headed up by Keith Wynn, Alan Schroeder, Chris Zach, and Elenia, and check it out. You can also find t-shirts, coffee mugs, and other merch at the Confusion Podcast store on Teespring. Also, be sure to check out the affiliate links in the description below. For business inquiries such as ads, sponsorships, and etc., please email rzkamer, Kamerer, at comcast.net. Thank you all for listening.